Hey, what's up everybody? After the incredible response I got from my Shadow Bomb Rogue build guide, it's time for another one, and this one's even better. If you thought HOTA barbs were dead, think again. I've put together probably the most fun build that I've ever played, rolling through Sanctuary at max movement speed, pulling in giant groups of mobs and turning them into jelly with a single hit. Not only is this build more than capable to solo tier 100 Nightmare dungeons, but it can also play a massive support role for your friends, constantly healing and buffing their movement speed, resource gen, and damage output, so much so that they're not going to want you to play any other build ever again, and you very well might not want to either. This guide is going to be split into 5 sections, each with their own timestamp chapter for easy reference. First, I'm going to be breaking down the skill tree, then I'm going to be getting into the gear, talking about what legendary aspects you're going to need and what stats you're going to be prioritizing, as well as the viable alternatives for both to consider while leveling as well as in the endgame. I'll then get into the high-level summary of the Paragon setup, and then once we've covered the skills, gear, and Paragon, I'll take some time to summarize all of the core synergies between everything all together. This is going to give you a much better understanding of the philosophy that went into putting it all together so that you can best take advantage of it while you're playing, as well as allow you to make the best decisions regarding what you have available to you personally in terms of gear as you're progressing with the build. And as a part of that, I'll also be covering some of these strategies, tips, and tricks to help you have as much fun as possible while playing this build. At the end, I'm going to be including a full, uncut run-through of a tier 100 Nightmare dungeon, which also happened to be the very dungeon that I hit level 100 with, so that you can see this build in action. I'm going to be throwing a link in the pinned comment to a build planner that includes all of the gear, skill, and Paragon info, and I'm going to be keeping that up to date as much as I can should anything change in the near future. Now also, if you're interested, I have a couple of videos that walk through the first 20 levels of my progression on this character with a bit of experimentation, trial and error, and tips and tricks for the early game leveling process that you might want to check out if you decide that you want to build your own barb after this video. Let's jump straight into the skill tree. Now for now, I'm going to be quickly running through where all of the points go, and in a later section is where I'm going to be explaining the why behind all of the decisions in much more detail. First, we're going to be putting a point into Lunging Strike, our basic attack, Enhanced Lunging Strike, which gives us some healing, and Combat Lunging Strike, which gives us Berserking when we crit. Then we're going to be moving on to our core ability, which of course is Hammer of the Ancients, which we're going to be putting all 5 points into, and then a point into Enhanced Hammer of the Ancients, which boosts our Fury generation based on how many enemies we damage with it, and then Furious Hammer of the Ancients, which increases our damage even more based on how much Fury we had when we cast it. And moving on to our defensive skills, we're going to want 3 points into Imposing Presence, giving us a 15% boost to our max life, and 2 points into Martial Vigor, giving us a 6% damage reduction against elite enemies. Then we're going to be putting a point into Rallying Cry, which is a shout that boosts our movement speed and resource generation, as well as giving the same boost, albeit slightly shorter, to our party members. Enhanced Rallying Cry, which makes us unstoppable while this shout is active, and Tactical Rallying Cry, which instantly gives us a boost of Fury and increases our Fury gen even more. Moving on, we're going to want to put a point into Challenging Shout, which is another shout that taunts all enemies nearby and grants us 40% damage reduction. 1 point into Enhanced Challenging Shout for another 20% bonus to max life, and Tactical Challenging Shout, which gives us a bit of Fury every time that we get hit. Now moving on to our brawling skills, we first want to put a point into Warcry, which increases our damage output by 15%, Enhanced Warcry, which grants us Berserking for 4 seconds, further increasing our damage 25% and movement speed by 15% during this period, and we're going to be taking Power Warcry, which will give us another 10% damage bonus if we use it while there are 6 enemies nearby. Now continuing on, we're going to put 3 points into Booming Voice, which extends our duration of our shouts by 24%, as well as 3 points into Raid Leader, which causes our shouts to heal both us and our party members for 3% of our max life per second while active. We'll then put 3 points into Aggressive Resistance and 2 points into Prolific Fury, which gives us 12% damage reduction and 12% Fury regeneration respectively whenever we're berserking. Now onto our weapon mastery skills, we're going to be putting 3 points into Pit Fighter, which gives us 9% increased damage to close enemies and 6% damage reduction against distant attacks, and 3 points into the No Mercy passive, which increases our critical strike chance against immobilized, stunned, and slowed enemies, which finally leads nicely into the single point that we're going to be putting into the Hamstring passive, which causes bleeding enemies to be slowed by 20%. Now onto my favorite skill that I personally think doesn't get enough love, Steel Grasp, which throws out 3 chains that damages enemies as it pulls them all together into a tight little group right in front of you. Then Enhanced Steel Grasp, which causes enemies damaged by it to be vulnerable for 3 seconds, And finally, Fighter's Steel Grasp, which grants you Berserking for 2 seconds after it damages enemies. Now moving on to the ultimate skills section, we're going to be putting the full 3 points into 4 passives here. Heavy-Handed, which increases our crit damage with two-handed weapons. Wallop, which increases the damage that we do with bludgeoning weapons to stunned and vulnerable enemies. Tempered Fury, which increases our max Fury by 9. And Invigorating Fury, which heals us for 9% every time we spend 100 Fury. Now finally, for our key passive, we're going to be going with Unbridled Rage, which increases our HOTA damage by a massive 135%, albeit at the cost of doubling its Fury cost, which is going to be a worthwhile trade-off, as you're going to see. Now, as soon as we unlock our weapon technique, we're going to be using the Two-Handed Axe expertise to give us a nice 15% damage buff against vulnerable enemies. And when it comes to our arsenal selection, we'll be assigning our dual-wielded swords to our basic attack, Lunging Strike, as this is primarily used to generate Fury rather than doing damage, so we care about attack speed more than anything. And of course, Hammer of the Ancients always uses a two-handed bludgeoning weapon, so that'll be chosen automatically. Now, a couple of quick considerations or potential modifications to keep in mind here is that this skill tree as shown is for the endgame, and you aren't required to strictly adhere to it while you're leveling. Feel free to experiment while you're leveling to see what'll work for you. In the early game, survivability is not actually really going to be as much of a concern as our speed and consistency of our damage output. At this point in the game, we generally want to progress as fast as we can, and I personally found a few temporary changes made a world of difference. You might want to consider putting 3 points that we have into Aggressive Resistance and or Martial Vigor instead into Swiftness, which increases our movement speed by 12%. Now, I also found that swapping over Fighter's Steel Grasp for Warrior's Steel Grasp to give it 1 additional charge helped me clear much quicker because I'd always have a charge available to snag big groups of enemies so that I can kill them in 1 hit, rather than 4 or 5, so that we're going to be clearing dungeons with less resources and in less time. Now, you might also want to consider using the Unconstrained key passive for a bit in the early game instead, at least until you're a bit more comfortable with resource management, as the increased Fury cost that comes along with Unbridled Rage can be a bit punishing, and in all honesty, most things are going to die in 1 hit anyway at this point. Alright, so let's take a look at some of the gear that we're going to want to use. For our helmet, we're going to be looking for cooldown reduction, maximum life, maximum Fury, and percent to total armor. Now, some alternative stats that are also acceptable are life on kill, plus to strength, and all stats. We're going to want to be imprinting our helmet with the Might aspect, giving us 20% damage reduction for a period of time after we use our basic skill, which is in the Codex of Power, although for most of the early game, the extra damage reduction isn't really going to be super necessary. I found it was most helpful when I started pushing Nightmare dungeons of like tier 80+, so another option that's really convenient during much of the early and mid game if you manage to find it, is the Weapon Master's aspect, which we only care about for the first half, the part that gives our Steel Grasp an additional charge. In the mid-game, if we opt for Warrior Steel Grasp and have this aspect on our helmet, we'll have 4 charges of Steel Grasp, allowing us to basically snag every group of mobs we see, smashing them all at once, probably the most satisfying thing to do with this build. Now we'll be socketing this, and for the sake of brevity, the rest of our armor as well, with rubies to give us a nice 20% total boost to max life. Now, of course, what I'm showing here is the perfect helmet that basically nobody is ever going to get, so for reference, I'm going to be showing all of my current gear for each of these examples, to give a little bit more of a reasonable and realistic example of what kind of gear you can expect to have. Here's my current helmet. Now, moving on to our chest armor, we're going to want to prioritize getting flat damage reduction from close enemies, percent total armor, and max life, with some alternative stats being basically any kind of relevant damage reduction, whether that's from bleeding enemies, from distant enemies, or damage reduction when we're injured. We're going to want to be imprinting this with a Disobedience aspect, which is available in the Codex of Power. Once again, for reference, here's my current chest armor. Next, taking a look at our gloves, we're going to want to be prioritizing plus ranks to Hammer of the Ancients first and foremost, and we'll also want to be looking for critical strike chance, attack speed, and plus to strength, with some fallbacks being plus to all stats and plus to dexterity. We're going to want to be imprinting this with the aspect of Berserk Ripping, which applies a percentage of our base damage as bleeding damage over 5 seconds, anytime that we deal direct damage to enemies when we're berserking. Now, this aspect is in the Codex of Power, although our berserking uptime and many of the bleeding synergies that we're going to be getting will be coming later on in our progression. So I found that in the early game, imprinting our gloves with either the Weapon Master's aspect or the Rapid aspect were really nice alternatives. Now, I managed to get quite lucky quite early, and was able to put together what's effectively the perfect set of gloves. Now onto our pants. These are likely going to be the only potentially problematic acquisition in the whole build. The recent buffs to temerity and barriers in general make using them simply far too tempting. If you happen to nab a few pairs of these during your late game progression, the two stats you really want to try and maximize are going to be the max life stat and the unique aspect, the barrier percent of your max life. Now I personally happen to have a number of extra pairs of temerity left over from my previous characters, so as soon as I hit level 80 I was able to use these, although I did also find 2 or 3 more pairs with my Barbarian as well. Until you're able to find temerity, a pair of pants with the same collection of stats as our chest armor with the same alternative stats as well are going to work just fine. And you're going to want to be making these a set of budget temerity pants by tossing on the protector aspect for the barrier, which is also in the codex. Now, these are my current pants, as well as some alt pants that I tried out during some of my testing, ultimately ending with temerity simply being better. Now taking a look at our boots, you're going to want to either look for boots that have additional evade charges, or a bonus to movement speed after evading. The most important stat you're going to want to be looking for is going to be movement speed, with some other important stats being fury cost reduction, berserking duration, and plus to strength, although some alternative stats include all stats, dodge chance, and damage reduction while injured. We're going to want to be imprinting our boots with the Ghostwalker aspect, which is available in the Codex of Power. And this aspect increases our movement speed whenever we're unstoppable, as well as for 4 seconds after, and just as important, it gives us the ability to move freely through enemies, which makes it really nice when we want to jump into the middle of a giant group of mobs and do some damage, and want to be able to get out in a pinch without getting body blocked. Here are the current boots that I'm wearing. Now, moving on to our weapons, the first thing to mention is that we're going to be wanting the same collection of stats for all 4 of them. Crit damage, vulnerable damage, damage to close enemies, and strength. Now, my reasoning for why we're going to want to prefer close over core damage is not only that close will apply to some of our other smaller damage dealing attacks as well, but more so simply that the maximum value for the range of close damage is higher than core. So all things being equal, we can eke out a few more DPS from a high roll on damage to close enemies than we can from core skill damage. Acceptable fallback stats include core damage in place of close, and all stats in place of strength. But I do want to emphasize how much I'm going to want to recommend that you get crit damage and vulnerable damage. Now lastly, we're going to be putting emeralds inside all 6 sockets on all 4 weapons, giving us an additional whopping 72% more crit strike damage against vulnerable enemies. Now looking specifically at our primary weapon, the two-handed mace, first and foremost, you're going to want to maximize the item power on this bad boy as much over 800 as possible, while still having a decent collection of stats, of course. This is going to have a significant impact on your overall DPS. We'll want to be imprinting our mace with the conceited aspect, which is going to give us up to an insane 50% damage boost whenever we have a barrier active, which is one of the biggest reasons why we opted for temerity. Now, conceited isn't in the codex, and honestly, in the early game, you don't even need to imprint anything on your mace, as you're very likely going to be swapping it out constantly for DPS upgrades, at least until you start to get the higher item power ancestrals when you're in World Tier 4. But if for some reason you're struggling to find conceited, I would suggest a few alternative tweaks that would then result in a slight shifting of priorities of what you're going to imprint on a few of the weapons that we're going to talk about shortly. Starting with putting Ancestral Force on your mace, which extends and boosts the AoE damage of your HOTA hits significantly. Some folks swear by always putting Ancestral Force on their mace, but in my testing, it simply didn't do as much damage as a good roll on conceited, which is why I prefer that first and foremost. Now, moving on to our one-handers, I recommend swords for both simply due to the implicit stat being crit damage, which is still too good to overlook. On our first sword, I'd recommend imprinting it with Ancestral Force, which is in the Codex, assuming that you have conceited on your mace, of course. And if not, then the Expectant is a great alternative, with the aspect of Inner Calm being a slightly less preferable, although totally viable option as well. Now, on our second sword, I recommend putting Edge Masters on here, which is in the Codex, so in all honesty, there really aren't any other aspects that I'd be putting here. And finally, onto our two-hander, which again I'd recommend is a sword for the crit damage implicit. The first thing I want to do is give a quick reminder that this sword is going to be a stat stick. We're not actually using it to attack, so its DPS is largely irrelevant. As long as this is over 725 item power after upgrading at the blacksmith, it's going to have the same affix values as an 825 item power sword, so don't worry about min-maxing item power on your two-handed sword. The affixes and rolls are what matter the most. Now, I recommend throwing on the accelerating aspect, which is going to give us 5 seconds with a 50% increased attack speed whenever we crit with HOTA, which I can't stress enough is such a massive game changer for this build, turning it from a relatively slow and methodical bash, move, basic attack, bash, move, basic attack, to a non-stop psychopathic hammerfest. We'll get into why this is so significant in a little bit, but in the meantime, it's important to know that this isn't in the codex, so if you happen to have conceded on your mace, but don't have accelerating available for your two-handed sword, you probably want to put Ancestral Force onto this guy instead in the meantime, until you do. Alright, now onto our jewelry. Let's get the Malignant Hearts out of the way first. The combination that I found that worked better than any others I tried was the Barber, the Heart of Focused Rage, and the Heart of Punishing Speed. Whenever you crit, the Barber activates and stores up all of the damage you do during its duration, increasing its damage every second it's active, after which all of that damage is released in an AoE explosion of shadow damage. As pretty much everybody knows, this heart is simply too good in this build to ignore, and I'd recommend the shortest duration possible, 2 seconds if you can get it. A Focused Rage is going to boost the crit chance of our next non-basic attack by up to an insane 40% after we spend a specific amount of Fury, the threshold of which we of course want to be as low as possible, although a little bit more on that later. Punishing Speed can have up to a 40% chance to knock down all enemies when we attack over a certain speed, which might give you a little bit of a hint as to why accelerating on our two-handed is so good. We're basically going to be knocking down almost half of the enemies that we're hitting, which is insanely powerful. Now, a few decent backup hearts worth using if you can't get your hands on any of these include the Malignant Pact, as each of its 3 modes synergize well with our build: attack speed, resource gen, and barrier generation. The Heart of the Calculated works really well to be constantly stunning enemies, and can actually lend itself to a strong combination coupled with the Retribution aspect should you also be struggling to collect some of the other offensive aspects that we discussed earlier. And finally, if you're having trouble with survivability at any point, the potential 20% damage reduction that you get from the Heart of Revenge can literally be a lifesaver. Now finally, moving on to the jewelry itself, let's look at our amulet first. You're going to want to be looking for cooldown reduction, movement speed, ranks to the Wallop passive, and percent total armor, with some acceptable fallbacks including flat damage reduction, fury cost reduction, and ranks to all defensive skills. You're going to want to be imprinting this with the aspect of Limitless Rage, which buffs our core damage output whenever we generate excess fury above our max, up to a huge 45%, because remember, amulets are going to boost whatever aspect is imprinted on it by 50%. Now this isn't in the codex, so I'd recommend honestly any of the other aspects we've talked about already that you prefer to help boost your damage in one way or another. I had Edge Masters and Berserk Ripping at various times on my amulet, and both worked perfectly fine as temporary solutions. Now both of our rings are going to have the same set of stat priorities: crit damage, vulnerable damage, crit chance, and max fury, with acceptable fallbacks including max life and resource gen. Now on our first ring, I recommend a slightly unorthodox aspect for barbs, the aspect of the Umbral, which generates fury whenever we CC enemies, and I'll be explaining in much more detail why later on. Now this aspect is in the codex, but you honestly don't really want to be running the minimum roll on this. I'd recommend running Umbral only if you have a roll of 3 or 4, and if not, suitable alternatives include the aspects of Echoing Fury and Berserk Fury, both totally solid fury generators, with the former being in the codex. Now last but not least, on our second ring, we're going to want to be imprinting Bold Chieftains, which is going to reduce the cooldown of our shout skills based on the number of nearby enemies up to 6 seconds. And this aspect is in the codex, so I honestly wouldn't recommend anything else. Now onto our Paragon setup. On our starting board, we're going to be hitting a few of the damage and life nodes on our way to the socket, where we'll be inserting the Territorial Glyph, which will give us additional damage and damage reduction from close enemies. We'll then make our way up to the Warbringer board, making our way through some Fury nodes on our way up to the socket where we're going to be using the Wrath Glyph, giving us additional crit damage, as well as generating Fury whenever we crit. And then we're going to make our way over to the Decimator board, where we'll be grabbing a few rare and magic nodes that'll give us additional vulnerable damage, physical damage, and maximum life, before hitting the socket inserted with the Martial Glyph, granting us additional damage and damage reduction from vulnerable enemies, as well as giving us the benefit of reducing the cooldown of all of our other shouts whenever we cast a shout. Then we'll grab a few more nodes that give us some more vulnerable damage on our way to the Bonebreaker board, where we'll socket the Exploit Glyph, which gives us some additional vulnerable damage, but most importantly, gives us the benefit of applying vulnerable to all enemies that we damage for 3 seconds, a crucial aspect of, frankly, most builds out there. Then we're going to make our way up to the Blood Rage board, where we'll be pathing over to the Legendary node that gives us a 10% chance to get 5 seconds of Berserking whenever we kill a bleeding enemy. Then over to a couple of Max Life nodes on our way to the socket, where we'll be inserting the Disembowel Glyph, increasing our physical damage over time, aka bleeding damage, as well as giving us the benefit of reducing our active cooldowns 10% of the time that we kill bleeding enemies. And then finally, we'll make our way over to the Weapons Master board, where we'll be inserting the Might glyph, which gives us additional physical damage, some armor, as well as a nice increase to our two-handed weapon damage. Now let's recap some of the core synergies that I've incorporated into this build. You'll recall that the third upgrade to our core ability, Furious Hammer of the Ancients, increases the damage of HOTA by 1% for every point of fury that we had when using it, which means that we're going to want to be casting HOTA with as much fury as possible, whenever possible. This is why we invested so much into increasing our max fury stat, getting up to 48 additional max fury from our gear, another 28 from our Paragon, and another 9 from the Tempered Fury passive, because this alone allows us to nearly triple our HOTA damage with a massive potential 185% increase when cast at full fury. Now, in order to get the most from this, we of course need to maximize how much fury we're generating at all times to keep the fury meter topped off, which is where the slightly unorthodox inclusion of the Umbral aspect comes in. Now, we don't usually see the Umbral used as often with Barb builds, but I found that it works extremely well for a few different reasons. And I suspect that its lack of popularity with this class is not only due to Barbs having a few other great options for fury generation, but also because most folks don't understand how many relevant crowd control effects there are for Barbs. It might come as a surprise to you that the pull-in effect of Steel Grasp is actually a form of crowd control. Now, this alone is insanely helpful, because it basically guarantees that we have fury exactly when we want it, even if we don't have our shouts up and without using our basic attack. Anytime that we're able to pull in a few enemies at once, it'll fill up our fury at exactly the moment we want to use it to smash the group of snagged enemies with a massive HOTA shot. Now, not only that, but we have a few other CC effects as well. Now, whenever we're berserking, the aspect of Berserk Ripping is going to help apply bleeds, which results in enemies being slowed, thanks to the Hamstring passive. Whenever we use Challenging Shout, nearby enemies are taunted, which is another crowd control effect. And the Caged Heart of Punishing Speed is constantly knocking down enemies. Just another way of applying CC. Now, all of these, coupled with the Fury generation from Tactical Rallying Cry, is why we're constantly full on Fury as we use our shouts right before or after we pull them all in. Now, related to this, whenever we're full on Fury, Edge Masters provides us another 20% damage buff. And even when our Fury is full, we're still benefiting from all of that resource gen, as the Limitless Rage aspect boosts our damage even more. Now, you'll also remember that we took the Unbridled Rage key passive, which increases our HOTA damage by another 135%, and you might think of this as a bit of an anti-synergy given that it doubles the Fury cost. But we more than make up for it if we pay attention to a combination of HOTA's Fury cost after all of the buffs and debuffs, and try to get it just over the threshold of the Focused Heart of Rage that we should have on one of our pieces of jewelry. If we have, say, 10% Fury cost reduction on our boots, HOTA's Fury cost, that's originally 35, gets doubled from Unbridled Rage, putting it at 70, which is then reduced by 7 from the boots, so let's say we're in the ballpark of 63 Fury cost for HOTA. If the threshold on the heart was a really good roll of anywhere under 63, that would mean that every single time we cast HOTA, the next non-basic attack's crit chance is increased upwards of 40%. So if we have a decent crit chance from all other sources, which should be in the ballpark of 30 to 40%, coupled with the No Mercy passive, which should add another 9% crit chance against all of the enemies we've just slowed, which is basically everything that we just pulled in with Steel Grasp when we're berserking, then we'll have a nearly 90% crit chance on every non-basic attack, meaning that the Barber is going to be constantly proccing, allowing us to do even more damage as AoE whenever the first enemy in every group dies. This is how we're able to do so much damage. Now, the next set of synergies revolves around us berserking, which gives us a 25% damage buff and a 15% movement speed buff by default. Now, of course, we like damage and we like speed, so naturally we want to be berserking as much as possible. And the most important thing that we generally want to be doing is getting in as many HOTA hits as possible within the brief periods of time that we are berserking to maximize that damage output. Whenever we crit with our basic attack, we're granted berserking for a second and a half. Enhanced Warcry gives us berserking for 4 seconds every time we use it, Fighter's Steel Grasp grants us berserking for another 2 seconds, and the Blood Rage Legendary Paragon node gives us a 10% chance to get berserking for the full 5 seconds when we kill a bleeding enemy, which as we know should be a self-sustaining process, as Berserk Ripping causes bleeds, and killing bleeding enemies causes berserking. Now finally, the Disembowel glyph also has a 10% chance to reduce all of our active cooldowns, which includes all 3 shouts and our Steel Grasp, by 1 second whenever we kill a bleeding enemy. Now this really adds up as we enter the much higher mob density areas, allowing us massively increased uptime on all of our shout and CC related effects, meaning we can effectively run around holding down the button that we use for HOTA, constantly hitting for full damage. Now, on top of all the base damage and movement speed buffs from berserking, we have additional passives and Paragon nodes that grant us buffs to resource gen, damage, and duration of berserking itself. Now, given that the duration of shouts and effects like berserking or bleeding are limited, we want to try to maximize the number of hits and kills that we can get in as fast as possible, which is why I prefer to put the accelerating aspect on our two-handed slashing weapon, giving us a massive 50% boost to our attack speed, as opposed to many other HOTA builds out there that I see trying to maximize every single point of damage they can possibly get, without taking into consideration what they're giving up in terms of attack speed, and how all of that's interconnected with the management of cooldowns. But this ultimately leads to a significantly lower damage output overall on average because they're just doing everything slower. They might be hitting slightly harder, but the time between hits is going to be much longer because of cooldowns or the speed of their attacks. Now, this also works really well with the Caged Heart of punishing speed, as pretty much all of our HOTA attacks are going to be crits, so nearly all subsequent attacks are going to be over the threshold to be constantly knocking everything down. Now, between the cooldown reduction from our helmet and amulet, the cooldown reduction we get from bold chieftains, the disembowel glyph I just talked about, and the martial glyph, which reduces cooldowns of all of our other shouts whenever we use a shout, we have a pretty nice shout uptime as long as there's enough enemies around to sustain it. And with all of the mob density buffs that we just got recently, this is a lot more often than you'd think. Now, taking advantage of the vulnerable mechanic is still critical to basically every build out there, even after the nerfs. So our goal is to never be attacking enemies that are not vulnerable, and we achieve this in a couple of different ways. First is the exploit glyph, which as we know causes enemies to be vulnerable for 3 seconds as soon as we damage them. But the most important thing to note here is that this can only happen once every 20 seconds per enemy, which is for the most part generally not an issue, as we'll usually one or two shot basically every enemy in the game, but it can become an issue when fighting bosses. So we augment this by using Steel Grasp, which will cause enemies damaged by it to be vulnerable for 3 seconds, pretty much on demand. Between the more than 300% boost to the raw vulnerable damage that we've gotten from our gear and our Paragon, all of the additional buffs we get from doing damage to vulnerable enemies like from Wallop, our two-handed axe expertise, and the damage reduction we get from against vulnerable enemies, it's super important to maximize the uptime of our vulnerability. So here's a pro tip for you. When fighting bosses or particularly beefy enemies, pay attention to their health bar, as it turns purple whenever they become vulnerable. So what you want to do is keep hammering them until you see them lose vulnerability, at which point I'd recommend ensuring your Fury is as full as you can get it first, and then hitting them with Steel Grasp, which has both benefits of applying vulnerability and giving you berserking for a few seconds. So between the damage buffs you have, the vulnerability you just applied, and your increased attack speed, you should be able to get in a few hard hits of HOTA within this period, which should basically shred them in no time. Take a look at this fight I did as an example of this, against a boss of a tier 63 Nightmare dungeon. Now I pretty much just walk up to them and hit him a few times with my basic attack, and as you can see I've already gotten Limitless Rage's 45% damage buff from the excess Fury. And the moment their initial 3 seconds of vulnerability from exploit wears off, I hit them with Steel Grasp, giving me berserking and making them vulnerable again, and all I need to do is hit them with a single HOTA shot, and then I wait for the 2-second Barber proc, and boom, they're dead. Now recall that we've really stacked on a bunch of bonuses to max life from all of our gear and Paragon, and this has a few different benefits. The barrier that we get from Temerity, the health that we gained from our basic attack, the health that we gained from our shouts every second that they're active, as well as the immediate buff that we get from challenging shout, are all based on our max life. So we're more than double dipping every time that we are able to buff our life total. And what's really nice is that the healing we get from our shouts is constantly overhealing us as long as we're full on health, which will maintain Temerity's barrier that's basically crucial to maintaining our damage output that we get from Conceited pretty much all the time. Now related to this, and something that many people don't know, when you're wearing Temerity and you're at full health, you can actually pop a potion anytime, and it will instantly give you a barrier. So I find it's honestly quite helpful to be constantly spamming potions during combat, as it might help keep you alive, but also helps keep your damage up, and the potion drop rate buff that also comes along with these pants will help keep these potions filled up. Just of course be careful that you don't overdo it. Alright, so what do you guys think? If you want to see more build guides from me in the future when I'm playing something fun or unique, please give the video a like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and drop me a subscription if you haven't already. All of your guys' feedback really motivates me to make more content like this going forward, so if you enjoy it, let me know. And last but not least, onto the Tier 100 Nightmare Dungeon run, where I admittedly got a little overzealous, leading to a single death, but otherwise, it went very well. I wish you all luck with your builds, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.